Okay, we are still talking about intelligence. This is part 2 of my lecture dealing with intelligence. Let's refresh our memory on where we were. At the previous class meeting, like 2 class meetings ago, gave you definition for intelligence, said a bunch of things about intelligence testing. Toward the end of my last lecture, I began discussing the controversy concerning the effect of heredity versus the environment on intelligence. I talked about how there's plenty of evidence that intelligence is to some extent influenced by heredity and to some extent influenced by the environment. The strongest evidence that we have that heredity matters involves studies of identical twins reared in different environments. At our previous lecture, I showed you correlation coefficients for these groups of individuals. R is our symbol for a correlation coefficient. Unrelated persons reared apart, correlation between their IQs is typically around 0. Siblings reared apart, that's like regular brothers and sisters, correlations between their IQs is around 0.24. And finally, identical twins reared apart. People that have the same DNA, the same genetic background, even when they're raised in different environments, raised by different families, there's still a relatively strong correlation between their IQs that they display in adulthood, correlation of around 0.75. Now that is some of the evidence that supports the idea that heredity matters. Going back to our big outline, I promised that was not the stopping point. On the big outline, I indicated I was also going to talk about evidence that the environment matters. And among other things, I'm going to talk about the Flynn effect and how it can be viewed as evidence that the environment matters in determining people's level of intelligence. I think I'm going to want to zoom in a little bit for this, just to be double sure everybody sees my lecture notes when viewing at home. Okay. Evidence that the environment also influences intelligence. Now, there's all kinds of strands of evidence along these lines. Here's the piece of evidence that I wanted to talk about in today's lecture. One piece of evidence that the environment matters involves the fact that IQ scores are rising worldwide and have been rising worldwide for some time. The fact that IQ scores have been rising over the last 100 years is called the Flynn effect, named for the philosopher James Flynn, who first wrote about this and observed it. The Flynn effect refers to the fact that IQ scores have displayed a substantial increase during the 1900s. That is, during the period from roughly 1900 through 2000, researchers observed relatively substantial increases in mean IQ scores displayed by the population. This Flynn effect, this increase in observed IQ scores, has been observed worldwide for all age ranges. I'm going to show you a figure that illustrates this Flynn effect graphically. You won't be tested on the figure, but I have some notes below it that put into words what's going to be illustrated in this figure. Let's put it up high enough so that you can see what I want you to see. Okay, this figure I copied from the book Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker. You've heard me talk about Enlightenment Now. Basically the book, let's move it a little bit this way, make double sure that you can see that y-axis. The book Enlightenment Now is about the positive effect that science, among other things, has had on human flourishing over the last 200 or 300 years. Among the things that Pinker talks about is the Flynn effect. What we're looking at is a graph in which the x-axis indicates year. The x-axis begins in the year 1905 and it ends in the year 2015. On the y-axis, we're looking at gains in IQ points relative to the earliest data. If everybody had displayed pretty much the same IQ from year to year to year, then the line would have been flat here at 0. If everybody had shown a gain in IQ scores of like 5 points, then it would have been at this point. As you can see, it goes all the way up to 35 and 40 points, and these are gains in IQ points. The gray line represents the gains in IQ scores for people in the Americas. I'm going to focus on the gray line. Notice at the very beginning of the 1900s, it doesn't move much. Starts going up in the 1920s, goes up and up and up and up and up until by the time we get to the this is around 2010, I believe, where the data ends. We see a mean gain IQ of over 30 points. So between around 1905 through 2010, average IQ scores in the Americas, that's North and South America together, showed a gain of about 30 IQ points. Let's put that into black and white word terms. For example, Neisser, in a paper published in 1997, found that for the U.S. population in 1997, mean IQ score was 100. If we had given the same IQ test to the U.S. population in 1932, the mean IQ score on that test would have been 80. The issue is that each year, people that publish IQ tests renorm their tests. If too many people are getting high IQ scores, they get rid of some of the easy questions, replace them with more challenging questions, and the consequence is, in order to get a relatively high IQ score in 1997, you have to perform much better than people were performing in 1932. Now this, of course, begs the question, why the increase? Most researchers agree that there has been an observed increase in IQ scores from around 1900 through around 2000 or so. Researchers disagree as to why these increases in IQ scores have been observed, but most researchers believe that the explanation, it can be explained due to improvements in the environment. During the time period when we saw this big increase in IQ scores, people experienced better nutrition, better health. People receive better schooling, more years of schooling, and yes, I'm going to show you some figures to back up those ideas. And importantly, we're going to see this is one of the explanations that seems to have gotten the most traction. Most of us are living in a more complex, more stimulating environment now than people were experiencing in the year 1900. So, better nutrition and health, better schooling. We're experiencing a more complex, more stimulating environment, and I'm going to have more to say about each of those issues in a second. Now, you don't need notes on the figures that I'm about to show, but I wanted to back up the idea that nutrition and health is better now, schooling is better now. Here's another figure from Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now. Let's back off with the focusing a little bit. We'll back off with the zoom a little bit to make sure that you can see the figure that I'm sharing. Okay, with this figure, on the x-axis, once again, we have years. This one begins way back in 1760, and it ends somewhere around 2020. Well, it actually ends before 2020, but in that ballpark. And what we're looking at on the y-axis is life expectancy, the age at which the typical person died. Life expectancy of 20, life expectancy of 30, life expectancy of 40, and so forth. This time let's focus on the dark line. The black line represents the Americas, North and South America. Notice during the 1700s, life expectancy was around 30. Now, that doesn't mean everybody dropped dead at age 30. There's people that made it into their 60s and 70s, but they were offset by a lot of people who died in childhood, who died shortly after birth. Notice that life expectancy is relatively flat for a long time, and then somewhere around 1900, life expectancy starts improving, in part due to better medical care being available, but due in large part to improvements in sanitation and public health. Around 1900, life expectancy goes up, so that around 2010 or so, life expectancy in the Americas is around 70. So yes, people are living longer these days. I said that the Flynn effect might be due to years of schooling. You don't need to take notes on this figure, but just to back up my argument that schooling has improved over the last 100 years. Once again, let's back off on the zoom a little bit so that you can see this figure. On the x-axis, once again, we're looking at year 1875, 1885. It ends somewhere around 2015. On the y-axis, we see years of schooling, how many years the individual was in school. The dark line that I've highlighted is the United States. In 1875, the typical American received maybe 4 years of education. Over the years of schooling went up, such that by the time the figure ends, somewhere around 2010 or so, typical American is getting a little bit more than 12 years of schooling. That means high school plus a little bit of college. So yes, years of schooling has gone up. That may be why IQ scores are rising. Better life expectancy, better schooling, and there's one additional reason that a lot of researchers offer as to why IQs have gone up. That reason is going to be discussed in a video that I'm going to show in a minute. The video is called Why Are IQ Scores Rising? This is a TED Talk of the same name. I'm going to show that in a separate video so that none of these videos are terribly long. So look for that in Intelligence Part 3. I'll show this video. I'll give you some questions to think about while you're watching the video, and then we'll talk about the main points made by that video. That'll be in Part 3 coming up.